there are many Palestinians who talk about resistance in a particular way, and when the language of Jew or the framework of Jew comes up, which I think we need to unpack and talk about in ways that absolutely resist and deny anti-Semitism. But we also have to understand Jewish is a national identity. And I'm thinking about Mohammed El-Kour's article where he's talking about, he's like, the Israeli flag is being waved, the Star of David is being waved. People are self-identifying as Jewish as they are engaged in the settler colonial project. And so when I'm resisting, I'm not resisting you because you are Jewish. I'm resisting you because of the settler colonial occupation. So I don't mean a particular, that's all I meant.
I get that. I get that. Okay, no, that makes it really, that makes it much, much clearer. And I think, I think that's and Muhammad's article, I do recommend it for folks. It's in Mondowise. I think he's developing it as well. But, he recounts the story of how, a gang of Israelis basically tattooed the Star of David into a young man's head. I mean, so, you have to ask, who is conflating these categories?
Right.
Who is conflating these categories? But the other thing, and here's where I just want to just note a couple of things for people, right? One is, I think we need to be talking about Hamas, because we don't talk about Hamas enough. They don't get to appear. They never get to speak for themselves or their representatives. Certainly, if you don't understand, Arabic or have any access to other, channel, they never get to speak. So they become this evil boogeyman. So everybody's going to agree on humanity and then say, but Hamas, right? And what you miss there, and I recommend Tariq Baqoni's work, very much shared Hamas Contained, and Khalid Hroub's work as well on Hamas, and Azim Tamimi as well on Hamas, and Helena Koban as well on Hamas. This is not something, they're not out of reach. This is a group with a history that we've seen develop as a political force that begins as an Islamic revivalist movement, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood that wants to, compel Palestinians to understand their condition of subjugation as a result of their failure to be good with God, right? And then it's in 1987, and it's the threat by other Palestinian political groups and actions, and even within that, push them to take on a national identity and become now also committed to national liberation as a movement.
Right.
Where they are using armed force. And their first operation that they launch it against 2 Israeli soldiers that they capture and kill. And that's when, that's when they become, initially securitized. But Hamas, Israel begins to circumscribe the Gaza Strip in 93, well before Hamas launches its first suicide attack within, what you call, the 1948 borders against Israelis. And they do that after the 1994 Ibrahimi Mosque massacre, when an Israeli settler basically guns down 29 Palestinians who are worshiping at dawn in a mosque. And by the way, in Hebron, there is now a shrine for him, right? And Palestinians are further securitized. The more they're attacked, the more they're engaged.
That's wild.
The more they're engaged and policed, right? And so, and then Hamas doesn't launch its first rocket, its first mortar fire until 2001. And that's in the aftermath of Israel beginning its operations of using aerial missile strikes in order to assassinate Palestinian political and military leaders. This is happening, in response. But the purpose here is to say they are developing in tandem in response to the Israeli use of force. But the Israeli logic, the Zionist logic of removing Palestinians, of engaging them, of subjecting them to permanent subjugation, well precedes the establishment of Hamas. Hamas has also demonstrated itself, right, to be a political actor. It is not, it leaves Damascus and it leaves Syria when it calculates for itself that it will not survive, right, what the Syrian uprising, and either it found itself in a lose-lose situation. Either it was going to side with the Syrian regime against all odds in order to quell the uprising, which would have negated its own calls for freedom, or it was going to side with the civilians and be crushed, right? And so they relocate to Qatar. They're making a political, this is a political group that is interested in its own power as a political formation. And I'm not out here defending them. Let me be straight. This is like, I'm sharing knowledge, but it's such an anemic conversation in this country. You want to have this whole conversation about October 7th when the supposed, you know, barbarians can't speak and can't be talked about.
Right. So I can tell you as a member of the media, it is literally that real and that true. I mean, if you're a guest, you have to ritually denounce Hamas as a condition of being on
speak.
Yeah. And
here you're going to have a conversation like you're having about October 7th when you already can't speak.
Right. And as the media guides for typically, at least in the international context, when we talk about groups, we tend not to use the word terrorist. We tend to use words like political organization, political movement, radical organization. We try not to call balls and strikes on who and what is a terrorist, because that becomes very problematic. But after October 7th, many media organizations were instructed that we have to use the word terrorism to talk about Hamas. And it's not even a question at a certain level whether you think Hamas is a terrorist group or not, or whether they engage in an act, a specific act of terrorism on October 7th. It's the fact that they're making new rules and specific rules for Hamas that I found and find somewhat curious. And then the last piece of that is you literally can't have. I mean, I've interviewed members of Hamas on Al Jazeera, but that's about the only space where I've even seen a kind of willingness to ask them questions, a willingness to engage them like an actual government organization, like it's someone that's actually administering Gaza, that's running Gaza. It's fascinating to see.
I mean, I just want to, you know, yes to everything that you're saying, and also note that, you know, Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization within the EU and the United States, but not globally. I mean, they're based in Qatar, right?
Right.
And the U.S. also bases, you know, one of its Navy fleets in Qatar. I mean, this is there's a lot of politics happening here. But they, as you mentioned, in 2006, they decide that they no longer just want to be an opposition force. Now they want to run for office. Now they want to engage the system. And the moment that they engage the system and then they assume power through parliamentary elections, that's when the siege is imposed. That's when the siege is imposed. That's when there is an attempt, you know, to oust them, a funding of Fatah as a rival force, to oust them even before they were never given the opportunity to govern and to fail. We might feel a different way if they were ever given the opportunity to govern and to fail. Later, everybody likes to talk about the, you know, Hamas charter. They amended their charter in 2017.
No one reads that version.
That charter in 2017, they even went so far as to say that, you know, they would negotiate for a two-state solution. They have entered into a Palestinian unity government recently in Beijing. They are in ceasefire negotiations. They are a political actor. And everybody seems to recognize that, except for, especially, I want to say, especially for those of us who live in the United States, where they have become such an anathema that we can't talk about it in the media. We can barely talk about it in the academy, right? And so now you're having a conversation where you're literally constructed one of the central player right now in a way that can't be spoken about. And
is it worse than the PLO was in Western, represented within Western media in the 70s and 80s? Is it the same? What would you say?
You know, I think that the talking points are the same. I think the talking points are the same. And from what I've understood about the 1982 invasion of Lebanon and the way that Western media frame that, right? And this is where Edward Said's seminal essay on permission to narrate comes up, right? That despite Israeli atrocities, what the UN did describe as a genocide in the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, where 3,000 Palestinians were killed, that, you know, especially US media continued to frame Palestinians and Arabs in general as the aggressor and Israelis as the victims, right? And so there they would point out that they hijacked planes, that, you know, they similarly were launching cross-border attacks, that they did not want to negotiate, they were not reasonable, even though the 1968 charter articulates, you know, a vision for a democratic secular state. And this is the work of racism. When a people is spoken about but never allowed to speak for itself. Right. And when we do speak, we're not trusted. When we do speak, we're not trusted. It's the reason that I spent so many years, I mean, less so now, but so many years before, where anytime I was invited to speak, either there was going to be somebody who was debating me, an Israeli who was debating me, or there was going to be an anti-Zionist Jewish person who was saying, it's okay, she's right, you can believe her. Right? But you know, this is the work. Yeah. This is the work. And we're still, you know, in this moment more than any other moment. And I really encourage people to learn more. I'm not saying, you know, certainly not saying support any political group. I'm just saying understand more about it.
Right.
Because a lot is being said. A lot is being said about this group that then we don't even know about and aren't learning about. And I encourage you, I listed a number of books. I encourage, you know, start there and, you know, read them on their own terms.